everyone here. My name is Zandra Wagoner. I'm our university's Interfaith Chaplain. And I'm just so glad you are here. You're in what we call the sacred space, and it's very intentionally made in such a way that anyone from any tradition can hopefully feel like they belong here, that they are welcome here. And tonight's lecture is exactly what this space was built for. So we're so glad to host this. I'm delighted to be one of the collaborators for this lecture, Baha'i-inspired lecture series focused on peacemaking here, bringing it here on our campus. We're excited about tonight's lecture by Dr. Derik Smith, his lecture entitled Fundamentals of Transformation. He will be formally introduced in a moment, but I do want to extend a special welcome and just thank you to our guest speaker and express some gratitude that you are here to open our first lecture for this year's Pathways to Peace lecture series. The university has a long-standing connection to the value of peace, a central value of the Church of the Brethren founders of the university. There is a significant resonance between the university's foundations and the Baha'i community. Baha'i communities are diligent advocates for the promise of world peace and have developed these very well thought out strategies to encourage peace through values of oneness and unity, harmony, justice, and the nobility of humanity. I come this evening with deep gratitude for this Baha'i community, especially in these challenging times, because in my experience, this community provides real avenues of hope. For over a decade, the university and the local Baha'i community have created meaningful and significant partnerships to support students, support their learning, their growth, to support interfaith engagement, spiritual community, and now this lecture series on peace. Thank you for any of you who are part of this community, for your supportive presence and for your spiritual vision. In particular, I want to extend a special word of gratitude to Soheila Azizi, who will be introduced in a moment, and her husband, Dr. Faramaz Azizi, for their vision and their contribution toward endowing this lecture series. The University of LaVerne has been blessed by both of you and the ways you express your Baha'i values and principles here on our campus. Thank you. This lecture series is jointly sponsored by the University of LaVerne, the Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of Rancho Cucamonga, the Baha'i Communities of Southern California, and the Baha'i-inspired organization People for Peace and Prosperity. The goal of this lecture series is to promote peace, both within, between us, and in the service of this audacious vision of world peace. And we're so glad that every person here is with us to be part of this audacious journey. So at this time, it's my privilege to introduce Soheila Azizi, who will then introduce our guest speaker. Soheila is an alum of the University of LaVerne's College of Law. She is an attorney at law and has a thriving practice in our community. She's also an active community member promoting social transformation, interfaith engagement, peacemaking, empowerment of youth, and carries a profound commitment to creating thriving and peaceful and prospering communities. So it's always a pleasure, always, to collaborate and partner with Soheila, a true hero and force for good in our community. Thank you for your ongoing vision and love that promotes goodness. And Soheila will bring her greetings and introduction of our speaker. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Dr. Wagoner. I go with Zandra, with her. Our relationship goes almost to 3 decades, and I didn't think she'll be introducing me beyond a name, but thank you. That was a very nice introduction. I have to express the love and gratitude of the Baha'i faith community for the last 3 decades of having this connection with the university as far as the School of Religion, School of Philosophy, as far as direct relationship with the chaplain, and the fact that year after year we've been receiving students to come and serve the Baha'i community. And then in exchange for that, we enrich our understanding of what the students want, what their concerns are, and then we're able to give back to a very small measure what we think will bring about unity and oneness. And I'm just grateful on behalf of the Baha'i community for this collaboration. And I just want to introduce Dr. Derik Smith. It's a long bio, and I will cut through some of it because you'll hear from him, and from his work and accomplishment, you will get to know Dr. Smith. But the fact that he is part of the Department of Literature at Claremont McKenna College, he is a chair of that department. He is also an affiliate faculty in the Intercollegiate Department of Africana Studies at Claremont College. His work is anchored around analysis of American culture, particularly African American literary culture. I'm going to shortcut some of the pieces and get to the part that he is now, as part of his work and his representation of the faculty, is with a working group that works on the Justice Education Initiative at the Claremont colleges. He is the acting director of the Wilmette Institute. We have another friend of ours, Jeff Albert, from the Institute, which is a distance education provider with a focus on discourses on social transformation. Dr. Smith's work has appeared in many publications. He'll probably introduce to you the book that he has authored, but he has been teaching courses about American prisons. He serves as executive board of the Association for the Baha'i Studies in North America, and he has his nonprofit organizations he might talk to you about, and he works on focusing on policy advocacy, and that's something that he might touch upon, and the reentry services and transitional housing in Southern California, where he lives with his wife, beautiful wife, Narmeen, and their 3 children there. Okay, so please get to know them after the talk, and you'll enjoy your getting to know them. So the themes of focus for Dr. Smith's discussion tonight is history, human nature, and power. And he will show us how Baha'i approaches to these subjects open important territories in the study and teaching of social transformation and building a peaceful society. So without further ado, I wanted to invite Dr. Smith to give you the pleasure of his conversation.
Thank you so much, Soheila. I really appreciate the introduction. Thank you, Farmers, for having us here. And thank you to LaVerne College and Chaplain Zandra Wagoner, right? One of the things that you mentioned in your introduction is the many strategies that Baha'is have for thinking about social transformation. And one of those is a commitment to learning. And so I want to talk a lot about that as we enter into a little bit of a discussion tonight. I also really want to just thank LaVerne for having my wife and I here. We are in Claremont at the Claremont colleges. And you know, the Claremont colleges, it's a consortium of 5 undergraduate schools. We are sister schools. So I can't quite say that we are sister schools with University of LaVerne here, but we are cousin colleges, maybe. I came up with that one. I hope you enjoy that. So we're cousin colleges here with LaVerne. It's great to be here. Also with my collaborators from the Wilmette Institute. Ima Sumak Maran Davis, who is also one of the collaborators at Wilmette Institute, and Jeff Albert, who drove about 70,000 miles to get here. So on the other side of Los Angeles, it's great to see you, Jeff. And also just welcome to everyone in the Baha'i communities and our friends who are here tonight. It's really wonderful to be with you. So I think what I wanted to do today is really kind of think about these remarks in relationship to the Wilmette Institute, right? I am a collaborator there at the Wilmette Institute, and one of the things that we're really learning how to do is to introduce discourse about social transformation in the higher education space. And what we want to do is bring insights from a Baha'i approach to social transformation into collaboration with higher education institutions. And what I want to do today is hopefully sort of offer a compelling vision of how we think about social transformation at Wilmette Institute and in the worldwide Baha'i community and among the friends of that community. And so I'll be talking about those concepts that were mentioned by Soheila before, this idea of history, how we think about history, how we think about power, and then how we think about human nature, and how looking at these concepts, which are key concepts of what we might think of as a Baha'i conceptual framework for understanding reality and also for changing the world to create social transformation, how when we do that, we can open up new territories of investigation and analysis. So I'll be getting to those three concepts in this conceptual framework of the Baha'i faith in a little while. But as I said, I think it's important just to remind everyone that the key pillar in that conceptual framework is the oneness of humanity, that we are part of one diverse, large, and single human family, and that human family is destined to recognize that oneness and all of its implications as history unfolds, and that will be a long and arduous path, but together we will inevitably get to that. That is a divine promise in the Baha'i teachings. So I think a good place to start is like, why transform? Right? I mean, like we might as well, one of the things we try to do in the Wilmette Institute is get to underlying assumptions. So oftentimes we might have this idea of, well, we should transform. Let's transform society, right? But there's good reasons for arguments to say, well, maybe we shouldn't think about social transformation so much. And so I'll try and offer up some of those reasons for you right now. Some of them are presented by someone you may have heard of, this professor at Harvard in the psychology department, Steven Pinker. About 10 years ago, he wrote a book called the better angels of our human nature, right? And he makes this argument that if we actually look at several hundred years of history, there is this incredible upward trajectory in indicators of the well-being of humanity in recent history, right? And so we can think about indicators such as life expectancy. How long are you gonna live? Right? That might be a good indicator of how well humanity is doing. And in the past 200 years, we see this kind of staggering, more than doubling of life expectancy for the average human being who's living on this planet. It's beyond that, right? We can also think about the things that we are thinking about, the considerations, the concerns that most human beings have. Right? And if we track that by looking at the rights of individuals, we can see that over just the past 50 years, there's been this probably, threefold increase in consideration of things like civil rights, women's rights, children's rights, gay rights, even animal rights. Human beings are now expanding beyond our own species to be concerned with the well-being of planets, of our planet and all the species that inhabit it, right? So we might say that we are on this radically upward trajectory in terms of like the well-being of humanity. If we look at certain parts of the world, probably all parts of the world, but in particular certain segments of our human family, there has been this precipitous drop in violence over the past several hundred years, right? And so the likelihood of being the victim of a homicide now as a member of the human family is quite less than it was at any point in human history, right? So again, why transform in the face of all of that? So in order to answer that question, I want to begin sort of with a very personal kind of approach to this desire for transformation and show you where I grew up in the Virgin Islands, right? So this is a tiny island in the Caribbean, And my parents here, my beautiful parents, Magda and Alan Smith, my mother is from Germany, my father is from Michigan, moved to this tiny island in 1976 in order to support the Baha'i community there. And so I was raised up in the Baha'i faith with these principles and this conceptual framework that I've already alluded to. And so as a kind of foundational, philosophical ground, I was continually thinking about the oneness of humanity and concepts that are sacred to Baha'is, such as justice and the need to eliminate inequality in the world. I was also contextualized by the 1980s Caribbean political aesthetic, I'll call it, right? That was a time not long after the massive kind of efflorescence, you could call it, of decolonization efforts in the Caribbean, where black people, descendants of formerly enslaved people, became autonomous political actors. And so there was a culture of independence and also a culture of attunement to injustice and inequality wherever it might have been presented. And so this was like a mural. This is called Black Utopia Lane in St. Thomas, a mural that I often passed when I was on my way to school. And it kind of had this Afrocentric and Pan-Africanist ideology that was kind of embedded in the art. And of course, I grew up in the music of that time period, reggae as a music that always called attention to injustices and inequity in the world and how we could address those. And so let's look at some other kinds of statistics which may indicate to us that the upward trajectory of things like life expectancy, although it is quite impressive even in the last 100 years, what we can see is this lagging, if you will, indicator of life expectancy in the continent of Africa, right? So there I would consider that an inequity around that indicator as a result of injustice. We can also look at, this is from very recent data, 2023, the number of people in any one given country that are living below the extreme poverty line of about $2 a day. Most of the countries in which people are subsisting under $2 a day are in sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, in my study as a student of world culture, African American culture, and what we can call Black studies, I've come to the firm belief that those realities are not because of any kind of inherent deficiency in those nations or in those people, but rather because of a history of exploitation and inequality that is perpetuated into the contemporary moment. Right? So that kind of injustice at a global scale is something that I think about often. But we can also begin to narrow down the kind of inequity and injustices that we see to a more localized scale. And if we bring it here to the United States, we see that in life expectancy in the United States, we see that those with the lowest life expectancy are native peoples to this land. American Indians, as they are, the acronym here has it, and then Black people are just a few years ahead in terms of life expectancy. So there are these discrepancies in those kinds of things. If we look at maternal mortality rates, the number of women who die in childbirth, it is comparatively speaking, of course, historically quite low, but even now we have around 70 Black women who die per 100,000 live births, which is in the most powerful economic country, the most powerful economy in the history of humanity, is, of course, a kind of travesty, right? And we see that that number is quite high as compared to those of other races. We can also begin to think about not just the kinds of indicators of well-being that are essentially material. We can begin to get into this emotional and psychological well-being of people who are living in the United States. And we know, maybe some of you are familiar with that book called The Age of Anxiety by Jonathan Haidt. It came out not too long ago. It really looks at the way in which the use of cell phones and social media has kind of brought on this epidemic of depression and anxiety in the younger generations, right? And so right now we've had this massive increase in the number of particularly girls experiencing depression these days. So as high as almost 30%. Imagine 1/3 of our young women are suffering from depression. Also, undergraduates have experienced the same kind of emotional, psychological, and spiritual malady, you could say, in the last several years. We have high degrees of anxiety. Those of you who are instructors and students on college campuses will probably be familiar with that social context of anxiety that kind of characterizes our moment. And we can draw in even narrower, right? Those who experience mental health challenges, oftentimes beginning in anxiety and depression, are oftentimes on their way, not oftentimes, on occasion, on their way into a situation of being unhoused, right? And in an economy in which housing is so expensive and mental well-being is so jeopardized, we can find it in our own county of Los Angeles that you have the highest number of unhoused people. Now, on their way to being this small percentage of youth, but still considerable, on their way to a life that may lead them to living on the streets or to being incarcerated, a lot of students end up being redirected out of our public school systems into private schools, which are designed to try to remediate, right, some of the harms that these students are experiencing. And if you were to walk just down the street from where we are right now, you'll get to one of those schools, John Macy School. It's a beautiful school with a beautiful faculty that is attempting to help out kids who are suffering from all kinds of, you could say, maladies of society, and are then acting out in ways that make it almost impossible for them to attend public schools. And the school like Joan Macy down the street here is doing a wonderful effort to try and remediate these students. And yet at the same time, oftentimes those who get to that point, they will not be able to recover and will end up in lives of incredible hardship. So I bring that up because it's so close to home. It's a stone's throw away from here, literally, right? And so I'll begin to think a little bit more about how do we begin to address these maladies that we have in society, and why not begin very close to home, right? So now I'll think about, together with you, how to transform. If we have a shared understanding of the fact that we need to have some social transformation going on, how do we do it? Right? That is a real question. And in the Baha'i community and in the Wilmette Institute, one of the ideas that we're really trying to bring in to these spaces of the higher education space is that the changes that we want are meant to be meaningful and lasting, right? And in order to create meaningful and lasting change, right? Not simply do the whack-a-mole approach to change where the malady rises its head and then we hit that down, but then it appears somewhere else. We have to have a radical vision. And by radical vision, some may assume this idea of a kind of disorder or chaos, right? This is what we associate with radicalism. But if we actually get to the true meaning of the word radical, you look back to its Latin origin, the term radix, right? Meaning root in Latin. One of the things that we begin to understand is that a radical approach, a radical vision, is one that looks at the roots of things. Right? And so in the Baha'i community and in the Wilmette Institute, one of the main approaches to social transformation is a vision that is trained on the radical elements of is a radical vision trained on the social maladies that we face, right? We're getting at the roots of issues. And so here's what I want to do with history, power, and human nature is to sort of get at these concepts and look at some of the underpinnings, some of the unspoken assumptions that we may have about these key concepts that are in a Baha'i conceptual framework and that are necessary to think about if we're going to create true, meaningful, lasting change in society. And these are the kinds of discussions that we try and foster with students in classrooms right now. And so I'll start with history. And what kind of vision do we have of history? This is a good question to ask. And in the Baha'i community, we have a very clear vision of history. And it tends to be one that differs from the vision of history that many people kind of reflexively hold to. And a vision of history that is not hopeful is held by many people, and we can see in this representation of data that those of the most recent generation, Generation Z, are in comparison to others more likely to have little hope for the world, or at least find it hard to have hope for the world. Some of them, a good percentage of them, wonder if there is even a purpose to life, right? So they're looking at history and they're saying, where are we going? And they have trouble even conceiving of a purpose to this pathway that humanity is on, and therefore having hope for the future. And this is for good reason, right? They look around and they see news cameras trained on horrible conditions in various parts of the world, right? They hear about climate disaster on the horizon, and they say to themselves, well, what hope is there, right? They're also filled by a cultural milieu, like a cultural ocean of visions of dystopia, right? If you look at the kinds of movies that we are constantly consuming, they offer us a vision of history that is not headed toward amelioration or to a kind of betterment of humanity, but in fact, quite the opposite. There is a descent that is imagined continually in these cultural texts that we are constantly consuming. So what is our vision of history? And what is the kind of vision of history that we try to cultivate in learners, in ourselves, and in our communities? And perhaps this is the kind of vision of history which is ultimately necessary for social transformation. And the way that we conceive of the vision is that it is hopeful. Hope, it is understood within the Baha'i community, is a depleted resource in humanity right now. And so perhaps it is important to foster hope among those who we come in contact with if we actually want to have change. If you don't have hope for the future, how can you work sacrificially for change, right? So we're trying to foster that. And one of the ways that we do that is by telling a story about where we are as a human race. And that story is one that is characterized by collective maturation. That collectively, this human family is like an individual that is moving from its childhood into its adolescence. And we know that when people are in a period of adolescence, they go through tumult and trial, and elements of your world that you may have come to take for granted begin to disintegrate as new forms of possibility are emerging, right? The turbulent adolescence is something that many of us have been through, that some of you are probably witnessing in your own families. I know it from firsthand experience with my 3 kids who are all in the midst of their, I still think they're in the midst of this turbulent adolescence right now. And we know how difficult that can be. We may think of it also as a period of transformation akin to the cocoon stage in the life of a caterpillar which is becoming a butterfly. If you were to dissect a cocoon and look inside of it, what will you see? You'll see the old body of the caterpillar disintegrating, right? It's not a pretty sight. But at the same time, as that caterpillar is disintegrating, the bone structure, the body of the butterfly is also integrating within that cocoon, right? This is the stage of maturation. This is the stage of sort of transformation that we are in as a collective humanity right now. And so as Baha'is, one of the things that we believe is that we need to channel the forces of integration. The disintegrated forces are going to do what they will, but there are these integrated forces that we can channel. And so the question is, how do we do that? How do we go about channeling these forces that are bringing people together. We can see in this beautiful building that we're in right now, with the beautiful diversity that is assembled here together, that there are forces of integration that are pulling us to be one family. We can see it if we just look around right here. We see exemplifications of that everywhere that we turn if our eyes are trained on it, right? But how do we channel that? How do we collectively allow those forces to be released, right? Well, one of the things that people think that they should do is engage in political action, right? Because political action is how you integrate the forces for change that you believe in, right, to move in a positive direction. And so right now we are in the high point, you could say, the apex, the summit, what else can we say, the hyperbole of our annual, our 4-year cycle of political engagement in America, and we have the presidential election coming up. I chose these various pictures of these guys pointing at each other and yelling at each other. And when you see the kinds of images that we have here, it becomes difficult to see how this structure might bring about the kind of transformation towards peace that we all are seeking. Not that it doesn't have a role to play, but it becomes difficult to see how that pathway is going to lead us into the peace that we all truly desire. I want to share with you an exchange that I had with a student last week. It was kind of an interesting exchange. It was Tuesday morning, I believe, and my class is on Tuesday at 6 o'clock, 6 to 9 every Tuesday. And this student quite audaciously wrote to me and said, "I hope you're doing well. I know you probably have an amazing class planned." I did. I'm very excited to discuss the readings, but I was wondering, right, is there any way we can watch a portion of the presidential debate that starts at 6? That's how students are these days. It got to be straightforward. You want something, you ask for it. Yeah. Okay. So here's my response. I responded so that you can kind of begin to see the way in which the ideas about political engagement are contextualized within the thinking of transformation that I adhered to, and which is inspired by Baha'i principle, and which we try to manifest in the courses that we're doing with Wilmette Institute. So thanks for your message. I admire your willingness to ask the question, right? Be gracious. And I understand that you're enthusiastic about the event, but I'm hoping that you'll be able to watch a recording. Why couldn't you just watch a recording, right? I won't reschedule the class so that students might see the debate in real time. My resistance to the idea isn't because I think our material or our schedule is sacrosanct, is like sacred, like we can't mess around with it. It has more to do with my skepticism regarding political theater. Although I'm attuned to the cultural and political debates that dominate American discourse, I have a dim view of conflictual and debate-oriented approaches to social questions. I believe much more in dialogue than in debate. I should have said consultation there, but I said dialogue. In consultation than debate, in cooperation more than conflict, and in construction more than competition. I believe that the existing systems do not work for most people, and that we can collectively build better systems. My approach to these kinds of things is radical, meaning it goes to the root of the matter. At its root, our political system is adversarial and competitive. It draws out the lower us versus them nature of human beings. I believe that in truth, there is only us. How can we build a world with that belief at its root? That's what I'm interested in learning about. And so there you see an encapsulation of the way that I think about our political context, right? And it's not that I don't believe in the necessity of some people working in the political sphere, and there are many people who are doing good in that realm, right? But I do think that we have an exaggerated sense of the way that social change will be created by political actors who are ostensibly working on our behalf, okay? Here's the interesting part of this whole exchange. Look at what she said. "Thank you for getting back to me. Your opinion and views you shared were refreshing in this time when there is so much pressure and attention in that area. I will keep what you said in mind," right? So here's the thing that I think is missing in so much of our discourse. It's this sort of idea that there is a different way, there's a different approach, that when we begin to look at the underlying assumptions of our approaches to social change and offer up something alternative, that it is refreshing. That's the word that she used, refreshing. The Universal House of Justice, which is the governing body of the international Baha'i community, said that what Baha'is should be doing alongside their friends and like-minded organizations is building communities that are havens of peace, places where a harried and conflict-scarred humanity may find shelter. That's what we actually want to do, I think, and that is what most people want. It's hard to see how many of the structures of social transformation, which we reflexively turn to today, like the political order that we are, constantly bombarded with, are going to create havens of peace, which is what people truly want. Even if they don't articulate it all the time, at heart you can see with this student, this is what she found refreshing, right? So how do we do that, right? How do we build communities that are havens for peace? And this is a really difficult question. Where do we start, okay? To keep it short, I'm not going to talk very deeply about this, but these are two political actors or social commentators on very different ends of the political spectrum. Mariam Kaba is a sort of an abolitionist, like one of those people who thinks that the police should be defunded. And Patrick Deneen is a political philosopher at Notre Dame, a Catholic thinker who thinks that the philosophy of liberalism, not the political stance of liberalism, but the philosophy of liberalism, which I'm not going to get into, is outworn and it must be changed. He is what people consider on the very far right end of the spectrum. Mariam Kaba would be considered on the very far left end of the spectrum. Both of them argue that in order to create the change that they want to see, we need to begin at the grassroots. Right? I was just talking with Gus about that a moment ago, right? If we want to see change, we can go over to Ukraine and Russia, and we can sort of fight in that war if we desire, or we can fight in the war of the streets right here, not through means of adversarialism, but through means of love, using the weapons of love, right? And when we do that, we want to prefigure in the present the communities that we want to see in the future. That is called prefigurative politics, right? Where we imagine a community and our means that we use to achieve and build that community are consistent with the ends that we desire. If we want peace, we can't use war to get there, right? And so we prefigure the communities that we want to see. Of course, in the American cultural history that we know, Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the primary exponents of this politics of prefiguration. He wanted the beloved community, and he, in his actions, attempted to live out and build that community in the present that he lived in at that time. But in order to do that, we have to think about things like power, because power is real, right? Power is exercised in ways that can be quite oppressive and harmful to many, right? And we often think about power in these terms as the capacity or the ability to direct and influence the behavior of others or course of events. And many people and groups are attempting to accrue power, seize power, gain power for themselves, right? This is the conception that we have of power as a finite resource, which we must fight with each other for, right? But there are different ways of thinking about power. In many religious traditions, there is a great deal of emphasis put on the power of love, the power of unity, the power of service, of humble deeds, right? The power that is created through those mechanisms is an infinite resource, not a finite resource. If we think about power in those terms, we begin to recognize that the fields of power which exist are quite different than how we often are asked to think. We're often asked to think in this realm of power, agonistic, unequal power relationships. That means competitive power relationships where one group exists or one person exists over another and expresses their power on that group that is being oppressed, right? Sometimes we think about the balance of power as in antagonistic nations which exercise balance of power against one another. However, we think much less about the power in this quadrant. Unequal, but still mutualistic, right? This might be the power that exists between a parent and a child, right? It's unequal. The power of a parent is much greater than the power of the child, right? But it is mutualistic. In the family, hopefully, power is being exercised for mutually beneficial means. And then there is this other quadrant of mutual empowerment, right? And we could think about these as cooperative power relations, all right? Now, there are literally tens of thousands of articles and books that are written about this limited field of analysis, oppressive power relationships, right? Which is right. It is right that there is much analysis of this area of power relations. But perhaps our exaggerated concern over that dimension, that quadrant in this, on these axes of power, prevents us from thinking about nurturative power relationships and cooperative power relations. To give you an example of a nurturative power relationship, I offered up the mother and the child. Imagine if we looked at history through the lens of the mother and the billions of acts of love and kindness that created the power that motivates the billions of human beings that have lived through history, right? There's not too many books about that love, right? And that power, right? Especially compared to the quadrant over here. Imagine if we thought about the cooperative power relations that existed in oppressed communities in order to have constructive resilience in the face of oppressive force. So imagine if we thought about the mutual cooperative societies that Black people created in America to sustain themselves through the most torturous type of social realities, right? How much has been written about that power of resilience which was created between people loving one another, caring for one another, right? And we can go beyond that. We can think about cross-racial in America, right? Moments of cooperation and the power that was created when people from different backgrounds came together in unity to create positive change, right? It's important to think about all these quadrants, but perhaps we don't think enough about cooperative power relations. So a lot of people would say to that, well, yeah, that's nice, but in reality, human beings are not cooperative, right? And that's a vision of human nature, right? Like we would have to think about, like, what do we conceive of as possible for human beings? And that negative view of human nature, this idea that human nature is inherently selfish, right? Is inherently uncooperative and oppressive, that comes from someplace, right? It comes from looking at the world through a certain lens. One of the places it comes from is the philosophy of John Locke, 17th century, very important social philosopher, right? Helped to sort of create the underpinnings of what we call the social contract, right? In which a state protects a citizenry that gives up some form of power so that it can enjoy certain kinds of comforts and safeties within that state, right? He thought that without society, human beings lived lives that were solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That philosophical vision of human nature underlies much of the social order that we inhabit today. The systems of capitalism, the systems of political adversarialism, the systems of law that pit one group against another group, right? This is the philosophical vision that underpins that kind of idea. I don't know if any of you read this, but I'll never forget the cover of this book that I was forced to read in 8th grade. Did anyone ever read this book, The Lord of the Flies? This is a classic of 20th century literature. The author, William Golding, won a Nobel Prize for it. It's probably been published over 15 million times at this point. For a period, I think that period is declining now, it was a kind of universally assigned text in Anglo in Anglo classrooms, meaning classrooms that speak English, right? In the 20th century, later 20th century, you were reading this book. The story goes that there was a group of English schoolboys that were on an airplane. It crashes on an island in the South Pacific. Everybody dies except for a set of young boys who inhabit this island. At first, they start out with the idea that they were going to create a sort of a cooperative society, but quickly, without the supervision of authority, it descends into chaos, right? They begin to worship like the head of a pig. You could probably remember that classic image of the head of the pig on the spear if you read the novel. And then eventually they begin to fight with one another. Wars break out. Several of the boys are killed, right? And then at the end, when finally order is restored, the adults return, a military man comes. He's talking to one of the young boys who was part of this chaos, Ralph. The classic line says, Ralph wept for the end of innocence, the darkness of man's heart. So this is what we taught many millions of 8th graders about what is at the heart of human beings, a darkness that when left uncontrolled, unstructured, will exercise tyranny, death, and destruction upon their brothers, right? It turns out that that's a very myopic, very narrow view of what human nature actually is. And there's not so much evidence that that is actually the case, this fictional story, when people end up in scenarios like the one that is fictionally described. One of the great sort of takedowns of this ideology that has been so important to Western philosophy is a book by Rutger Bregman called Humankind, A Hopeful History. And in that book, one of the stories that he comes upon and elaborates in really compelling terms is that of 6 Tongan boys who set out from their school. They were playing hooky. They wanted to get away from the oppressive classroom. And so they set out on this journey on a stolen boat. So they weren't like the best. They weren't like the valedictorians of the class, right? These were the bad kids. They stole the boat, went out, and they lost their way. They were shipwrecked on an island. They were there for an entire year in 1966. What did they do? They formed a society. They formed a structure by which they would help one another out. They formed means by which they could deal with conflict. One boy, if he was arguing with another, would be sent to one side of the island, and then the other boy would be sent to the other side of the island. They would calm down. They would come back. They would start each day and end each day with prayer and singing. And they survived for a year until they were rescued by the gentleman in the middle of the picture here. So this offers up a very different version of human nature than the one that we are exposed to on the regular, and which may be underpinning the kinds of many of the social structures that draw out from us, right? Our adversarial competitive nature. Okay, we exist in systems which are constantly pitting us against one another, right? And that perhaps to create meaningful and lasting change, we have to develop and conceive of systems that don't elicit from us the competitive, lower nature, which is part of human reality, right? But instead which draws out that which is spiritual, the higher nature. Right? The nature that is elicited from prayer, from song, from community, right? Perhaps we need to think about how do we construct societies and communities that are built around those kinds of structures which elicit from human beings their nobility. Baha'u'llah says that noble have I created thee, yet thou hast abased thyself. Rise then unto that for which thou wast created. There is a higher nobility in each of us as human beings. That nobility must be called upon in order to create the kinds of transformation which are possible and which we have to learn how to elicit. The vision that we need for creating that kind of society and those communities is one that's radical. It needs to look at the underpinning of our assumptions of concepts like history, like power, like human nature, and it needs to be willing to reconceive of those things. And in the classrooms that Wilmette Institute works with the students that we work with, one of the things that we are trying to do is think about these concepts and many others from a standpoint which is not academic explicitly, which is not simply about thinking in theory about these things, but rather trying to build them in community with others. In fact, one could say that with the Wilmette Institute and in the Baha'i community generally, we are working with a form of radical constructive agency, where we are attempting to build something through the agency of protagonists of all sorts, coming together with a radical vision, looking at the roots of things, being willing to reconceive them, and try to create communities that we all will love, communities that are havens of peace, and that we will get to by walking on pathways to peace. I'll stop there, and just a real appreciation for you spending some time with my thoughts here. I think they went on for much too long. I'm sorry.